The morning sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty town of Red Mesa, Arizona Territory. In the summer of 1883, Jack "Lone Wolf" Morrison rode his weathered stallion down the main street, his hat pulled low over piercing blue eyes that had seen too much violence in his 32 years. The leather holsters on his hips carried twin Colt .45s, weapons that had saved his life more times than he cared to count. Jack was what folks called a drifter, moving from town to town with no particular destination in mind. He'd been a cavalry officer once, back before the Apache Wars took everything from him. Now he lived by his own rules, taking odd jobs and staying just long enough to earn enough money for supplies and whiskey. As he guided his horse toward the local saloon, something caught his attention. A crowd had gathered near the town square, their voices rising in excitement and anger. Jack dismounted and pushed through the gathered townspeople, his curiosity getting the better of him. What he saw made his blood run cold. 3 Apache women stood on a makeshift gallows platform, nooses around their necks. The youngest couldn't have been more than 16, while the eldest appeared to be in her 40s. All 3 had their hands bound behind their backs, their dark eyes showing defiance despite their desperate situation. "What's the charge against these women?" Jack called out to the crowd. A well-dressed man in a black suit and bowler hat stepped forward. This was Theodore Blackwood, the town's self-appointed judge and most powerful businessman. His pale face was marked by a cruel smile that never reached his cold gray eyes. "These savages murdered innocent settlers," Blackwood announced, his voice carrying across the square. "The Henderson family was found dead on their homestead 3 days ago. These 3 were caught nearby with stolen goods." Jack studied the women more carefully. Their clothes were simple but clean, not the attire of raiders. The youngest woman met his gaze, and he saw something there that troubled him deeply. It wasn't the look of a killer, but of someone who had witnessed something terrible. "Where's the evidence?" Jack demanded, stepping closer to the platform. Blackwood's smile faltered slightly. "We don't need to explain ourselves to every drifter who rides into town, stranger. This is frontier justice." The crowd murmured their agreement, but Jack noticed that several townspeople looked uncomfortable. An older Mexican man named Carlos, who ran the general store, stepped forward nervously. "Senor Blackwood, perhaps we should wait for the territorial marshal. These women deserve a proper trial." Blackwood's face hardened. "The law is what we make it out here, Carlos. These Apache killed the Hendersons in cold blood. They'll hang at noon." Jack checked his pocket watch. It was already 11:30. He had 30 minutes to figure out what was really happening here. Something about this whole situation felt wrong. In his years fighting the Apache, he'd learned that their warriors were fierce but followed strict codes of honor. Women rarely participated in raids, and when they did, it was only under extreme circumstances. He approached the eldest Apache woman, who carried herself with the dignity of a tribal elder. Speaking in the broken Apache he'd learned during the wars, he asked her name. "I am Morningstar," she replied in English, her voice strong despite her circumstances. "These are my daughters, Little Dove and Singing Bird. Did you kill the Henderson family?" Morningstar's eyes flashed with anger. "We did not kill anyone. We came to Red Mesa to trade as we have done for many seasons. We found the White family already dead. What stolen goods were you carrying?" "Blankets and food. Items we brought to trade for winter supplies." Jack turned to face the crowd. "These women say they came here to trade. Where are the goods they supposedly stole from the Hendersons?" Blackwood waved dismissively. "Burned as evidence of their crimes." "Mighty convenient," Jack muttered. He'd seen enough kangaroo courts to recognize one. Something was driving Blackwood's rush to execute these women, and it wasn't justice. A young deputy named Tommy Walsh approached Jack nervously. Tommy couldn't have been more than 20, with sandy hair and freckles that made him look even younger. Jack could see the doubt in the boy's eyes. "You seem troubled by all this, son," Jack said quietly. Tommy glanced around to make sure no one else was listening. "I was with the posse that found these women. They weren't acting like killers. They were just sitting by their small fire cooking rabbit. When we approached, they didn't run or fight. The oldest one even offered us food." "What about the stolen goods?" "Just some blankets and dried meat. Nothing that looked like it came from the Henderson place." Tommy's voice dropped to a whisper. "And there's something else. I saw tracks around the Henderson homestead. Shod horses, not unshod ponies like the Apache ride." Jack's mind raced. Shod horses meant white men, not Apache raiders. Someone was using these women as scapegoats, but why? The church bell began to toll noon. Blackwood climbed the steps to the gallows platform, his hand resting on a lever that would drop the trapdoors beneath the three women's feet. "People of Red Mesa," he called out. "Today we deliver justice for the brutal murder of an innocent family." Jack knew he had to act fast. His hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but he quickly realized that drawing on an entire town would only get him killed along with the Apache women. He needed a different approach. "Wait," he shouted, stepping forward. "As a former cavalry officer, I have the right to examine the evidence before sentence is carried out." Blackwood hesitated. The crowd murmured uncertainly. Several people knew that military officers had certain legal authorities in the territories, even retired ones. "You have no authority here." "Drifter," Blackwood snarled. "Actually, I do." Jack pulled out his discharge papers, which still bore the official seal of the United States Army. Territorial law grants military personnel the right to review evidence in capital cases involving Indian affairs. It was a bluff, but a convincing one. Blackwood's face reddened with anger, but he couldn't afford to appear to be defying federal authority in front of the townspeople. "You have 5 minutes," Blackwood spat. Jack knew 5 minutes wouldn't be nearly enough to uncover the truth, but it was a start. As he approached the gallows, he caught the eye of Morningstar once again. "Trust me," he whispered in Apache. Her response surprised him. "The white man with the mark of the snake seeks our land. The truth lies beneath the red rocks where the silver water flows." Before Jack could ask what she meant, Blackwood was shouting for the execution to proceed. Time was running out, and Jack realized he was about to witness an injustice that would haunt him forever unless he found a way to stop it. Jack's mind raced as he tried to decode Morningstar's cryptic message. The white man with the mark of the snake had to be significant, but he couldn't place it immediately. The reference to red rocks and silver water was equally puzzling, though it sounded like she was describing a specific location. "Time's up." "Morrison," Blackwood announced, his hand moving toward the lever again. Jack made a desperate decision. In one fluid motion, he drew both his Colts and aimed them at the ropes holding the nooses. The crowd gasped and scattered as he fired 6 shots in rapid succession, cutting through the thick hemp with deadly accuracy. The 3 Apache women collapsed to the platform floor as their bonds fell away, gasping and rubbing their necks where the rough rope had chafed their skin. "You've just signed your own death warrant." "Drifter," Blackwood hissed, drawing his own weapon, but Jack was already moving. He holstered his empty guns and dove behind a nearby water trough as bullets whistled overhead. The townspeople were screaming and running for cover as Blackwood's men opened fire. "Get to the horses," Jack shouted to the Apache women in their own language. Morningstar understood immediately. Despite their ordeal, the 3 women moved with the grace and speed of their people, rolling off the platform and sprinting toward the horses tied near the saloon. Jack provided covering fire with his rifle, which he'd grabbed from his saddle before taking cover. Young Deputy Tommy Walsh stood frozen in the middle of the chaos, his gun still holstered. Jack could see the conflict in the boy's eyes as he watched the events unfold. "Tommy," Jack called out. "You know this isn't right. Help us." For a moment, Tommy hesitated. Then he made his choice. Instead of drawing his weapon, he deliberately tripped one of Blackwood's gunmen who was pursuing the women, sending the man sprawling into the dust. Blackwood noticed the deputy's betrayal immediately. "Walsh, you're finished in this town!" But Tommy had already made his decision. He ran toward Jack's position, drawing fire from Blackwood's remaining men. A bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around, but he managed to reach the safety of the water trough. "Why are you helping them?" Jack asked as he bandaged Tommy's wound with a strip torn from his shirt. "Because I've seen enough innocent people die," Tommy replied grimly. "My pa was a sheriff before Blackwood came to town. Pa started asking too many questions about some land deals, and one night he just disappeared. Blackwood said he must have left town, but I found his horse 3 days later with blood on the saddle." Jack understood now. Blackwood wasn't just a corrupt businessman. He was a murderer who used his position to eliminate anyone who threatened his interests. The Apache women had simply been convenient scapegoats for whatever scheme he was running. "We need to get out of town and find evidence," Jack said. "Can you ride?" Tommy nodded, though his face was pale from blood loss. "I know a back way out of town." "But where are we going?" "The Henderson homestead." Morningstar said something about red rocks and silver water. "There's more to this than just a simple murder." They waited for a lull in the gunfire, then made their move. Jack's horse was a seasoned cavalry mount, trained to remain calm under fire. The Apache women had already mounted 3 horses they'd appropriated from the hitching posts, and they sat waiting with the patience of experienced riders. The group of 6 rode hard out of Red Mesa, taking the narrow trail that wound behind the church and through a grove of cottonwood trees. Bullets followed them, but they were quickly out of range. As they rode, Jack noticed that Morningstar was leading them in a specific direction, not just fleeing randomly. She seemed to know exactly where she was going. "The Silver Water," she called back to him. "It flows near the place where the White family died." After an hour of hard riding, they reached Silver Creek, a stream that got its name from the way sunlight reflected off its surface. The water flowed between towering red sandstone formations that jutted up from the desert floor like ancient monuments. There, Morningstar pointed to a spot where the creek made a sharp bend around a particularly large red rock formation. "We made camp there 2 nights ago before we found the dead family." They dismounted and examined the area carefully. Jack's military training had taught him to read sign, and what he found troubled him deeply. The tracks Tommy had mentioned at the Henderson place were here too, shod horses and lots of them. At least 8 riders, Jack concluded. They came here first, then went to the Henderson homestead. "But why?" Tommy asked. Morningstar had been examining the ground near their old campsite. She called them over with urgent words in Apache. "What is it?" Jack asked. "She says to look at what the white men were digging for." Little Dove translated, speaking English for the first time. Jack knelt down and examined the area more carefully. Someone had been digging holes near the base of the red rock formation, but they'd tried to cover their tracks by scattering brush over the disturbed earth. "Tommy, help me clear this away." As they worked, a picture began to emerge. The holes weren't random. They formed a pattern, as if someone had been following a map or survey markers. "Silver," Singing Bird said suddenly, holding up a small chunk of ore she'd found in the discarded dirt. Jack examined the rock specimen. It was definitely silver ore and high quality from the look of it. "There's a silver vein running through this rock formation. That explains everything," Tommy said with growing understanding. "Blackwood's been buying up land all around this area. My pa was investigating those land deals when he disappeared. The Henderson homestead sits right on top of this silver deposit," Jack realized. Blackwood needed them gone, but he couldn't just murder a white family without serious consequences. So he killed them and blamed the Apache. Morningstar spoke again and Little Dove translated. "My mother says the white men came to our camp and demanded we leave. When we refused, they said we would be blamed for something terrible. We didn't understand what they meant until we found the dead family the next morning. They were planning to frame you from the beginning," Jack said grimly. "You walked right into their trap." A new voice cut through the desert air. "Very clever, Morrison. Too bad you'll never live to tell anyone." They spun around to see Blackwood approaching with 6 armed men. The group had been so focused on their investigation that they'd failed to notice they were being tracked. "Should have minded your own business. Drifter," Blackwood continued, his gun trained on Jack. "This land is worth more than you can imagine. Silver prices are up, and I've already got investors lined up from back east." "So you murdered an innocent family for money," Jack said, his hands moving slowly toward his guns. "Business is business. The Hendersons wouldn't sell, and the Apache were perfect scapegoats. Savage Indians killing innocent settlers. It's a story everyone would believe. Except now we know the truth." Blackwood laughed coldly. "The truth dies with you. All of you." Jack knew they were in a desperate situation. 6 guns against 6 people, but only he and Tommy were armed, and Tommy was wounded. The Apache women were brave, but they had no weapons. But Morningstar had one more surprise. She spoke a single word in Apache, and suddenly the red rocks around them came alive with movement. A dozen Apache warriors materialized from concealment, their war paint making them look like ghosts rising from the stone itself. "My husband and his warriors have been tracking us since we failed to return home," Morningstar explained calmly. "Apache do not abandon family." Blackwood's face went white as he realized he was now outnumbered 2-1 by some of the finest fighters on the frontier. "Drop your weapons," Jack commanded. "It's over, Blackwood." But the corrupt businessman wasn't ready to surrender. With a snarl of rage, he raised his gun and fired. The gunshot echoed off the red rocks like thunder. Blackwood's bullet whined past Jack's ear, close enough that he could feel the heat from the lead. In the next instant, the desert exploded into chaos as both sides opened fire. Jack dove behind the nearest boulder, dragging Tommy with him. The young deputy's wounded shoulder was bleeding again from the sudden movement, but he still managed to return fire with his revolver. The Apache warriors moved like shadows among the rocks, using every piece of cover to their advantage. Their war cries filled the air as they flanked Blackwood's men from multiple directions. These weren't the reservation Apache that many whites had grown used to seeing. These were free warriors who had been fighting for their homeland since childhood. Morningstar and her daughters had found shelter behind a fallen log, but Jack could see they were trapped in the crossfire. One of Blackwood's men, a scarred gunfighter named Cutter Williams, had positioned himself where he could pin them down with rifle fire. "Cover me," Jack told Tommy, then sprinted across the open ground toward Cutter's position. Bullets kicked up dust around Jack's feet as he ran in a zigzag pattern, making himself a harder target. Cutter saw him coming and swung his rifle around, but he was too slow. Jack tackled him around the waist and both men went down hard. They rolled in the dirt, fighting for control of Cutter's weapon. The gunfighter was bigger than Jack, but Jack had learned dirty fighting tricks during his cavalry days. He drove his knee into Cutter's ribs, then grabbed a handful of sand and threw it in the man's eyes. Cutter cursed and swung blindly with his fist, catching Jack on the jaw hard enough to make him see stars. But it gave Jack the opening he needed to wrench the rifle away and slam the stock into Cutter's temple, dropping him unconscious. Across the battlefield, Blackwood was shouting orders to his remaining men, but they were clearly losing the fight. The Apache warriors had superior numbers and knew the terrain better than anyone. Two of Blackwood's gunfighters were already down, one dead and the other badly wounded. "Retreat to the horses," Blackwood yelled. "We'll regroup in town." But as his men tried to pull back, they found their escape route blocked by 3 more Apache warriors who had circled around behind them. The trap was complete. "Surrender now and you'll get a fair trial," Jack called out, his rifle trained on Blackwood. "Like the fair trial you gave those Apache women?" Blackwood snarled back. "That's the difference between us. I believe in real justice, not frontier vengeance." For a moment, it seemed like Blackwood might give up. His remaining men were clearly ready to throw down their weapons. They'd signed up to intimidate homesteaders and run off Apache, not fight a pitched battle against seasoned warriors. But Blackwood had too much to lose. If the truth about the Henderson murders came out, he'd face the gallows himself. Instead of surrendering, he grabbed Little Dove, who had been trying to reach her mother's position. The young Apache woman cried out as Blackwood pressed his gun to her head. "Let me go or the girl dies," he threatened. The shooting stopped abruptly. Even the Apache warriors held their fire, unwilling to risk hitting Morningstar's daughter. "Let her go," Jack said, his voice deadly calm. "This is between you and me. Drop your weapons, all of you. I'm riding out of here and the girl comes with me." Morningstar spoke urgently in Apache. Her husband, Stone Bear, was clearly struggling with the decision. Every instinct told him to attack, but his daughter's life hung in the balance. Jack studied the situation carefully. Blackwood was nervous, his gun hand shaking slightly. The man was a schemer and a murderer, but he wasn't an experienced gunfighter. He was used to having others do his dirty work. "What's your plan, Blackwood?" Jack asked, trying to buy time. "Even if you get out of here, where are you going to go? The territorial marshal will hunt you down. I've got friends in high places, politicians who've invested in my land deals. They'll make sure this all gets swept under the rug. Not when the truth comes out about the silver mine. Too many people will want answers." Blackwood's face twisted with rage. "You should have minded your own business, Morrison. This could have been simple, 3 dead Indians and a closed case. Except they weren't just 3 Indians. They were innocent people, just like the Henderson family. The Hendersons were fools who wouldn't take good money for worthless land. So you decided to take it by force." Jack was slowly moving to his left, trying to get a clear shot that wouldn't endanger Little Dove. The young woman met his eyes and gave an almost imperceptible nod, as if she understood what he was planning. "The land deals are legal," Blackwood continued. "I had papers drawn up." "Forged papers," Tommy interrupted, surprising everyone. The wounded deputy had found a second wind and was back on his feet. "I found copies in my PA's things before he disappeared. The real Henderson deed was completely different." Blackwood's face went pale. "That's impossible." "I burned all the original documents." All except the one my pa hid in his saddlebags. Jack realized Tommy was bluffing, but it was working. Blackwood was rattled, his attention divided. It was the opening Jack had been waiting for. "Little dove," he called out in Apache. "When I count to 3, drop down." The young woman tensed, ready to move. 1. Blackwood swung his gun toward Jack, realizing too late that he'd been outmaneuvered. 2. Little dove suddenly went limp, dropping like a stone. Blackwood, unprepared for her dead weight, stumbled forward. 3. Jack's shot took Blackwood in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his weapon flying. The corrupt businessman fell to his knees, clutching his wounded arm. But the fight wasn't over. The last 2 of Blackwood's men, seeing their leader down, made a desperate charge toward the horses. They ran straight into Stone Bear and 2 other Apache warriors, who had been waiting for exactly this moment. The brief scuffle ended quickly, with both gunfighters on the ground, disarmed and defeated. "It's finished," Jack announced, looking around at the aftermath of the battle. "The truth is going to come out." Blackwood glared at him with pure hatred. "You think you've won something? I have powerful friends. This won't stick." "Maybe," Jack admitted, "but at least these women won't hang for crimes they didn't commit." Morningstar approached and spoke to Jack in English. "You have given my family their lives back. The Apache people will remember this. Just make sure the real story gets told. That's all the payment I need." Tommy was examining the silver ore samples they'd found. "This is going to change everything for Red Mesa. If there's really a rich vein running through this area, the territorial government will take over the investigation," Jack said. "Proper surveys, legal mining claims, fair compensation for anyone who got cheated." Stone Bear and his warriors had tied up Blackwood and his surviving men with rawhide bonds that would hold them securely until they could be transported back to town. The Apache leader approached Jack with obvious respect. "You fight well for a white man," he said in careful English. "My wife says you were once a soldier, a long time ago. I fought against your people back then, and now you fight for them. A man can change. This is good." As the sun began to set behind the red rocks, Jack realized that something had changed inside him too. For the first time in years, he felt like he'd done something that truly mattered. He'd prevented an injustice and maybe even helped prevent a war between the Apache and the white settlers. But he also knew that the real battle was just beginning. Getting the truth accepted by the territorial authorities would be a challenge, especially with Blackwood claiming to have powerful political connections. The journey back to Red Mesa took place under the cover of darkness. Jack led the unusual procession, with Tommy riding beside him despite his wounded shoulder. Behind them, Stone Bear and his warriors escorted the bound prisoners while Morningstar and her daughters brought up the rear. As they approached the town, Jack could see lights burning in many windows. Word of the day's events had clearly spread, and the townspeople were waiting to see what would happen next. "They're scared," Tommy observed, watching the shadowy figures moving behind curtains. "They should be," Jack replied grimly. "Their whole world is about to change." They rode straight to the sheriff's office, where they found a crowd gathered outside. Carlos, the Mexican shopkeeper who had spoken up earlier, stepped forward as they dismounted. "Senor Morrison, is it true? Did Blackwood really kill the Henderson family?" "It's true, Carlos. We found evidence at Silver Creek. Blackwood's been running a land-grabbing scheme, murdering anyone who wouldn't sell." The crowd murmured anxiously. Many of these people had sold land to Blackwood over the past year, often under pressure or threats. "What about the silver?" called out Mrs. Patterson, the widow who ran the boarding house. "Is it real?" Tommy held up the ore samples they'd collected. "Real as anything I've ever seen. This area could be sitting on one of the richest deposits in the territory." The implications hit the crowd immediately. Property they'd sold for almost nothing might be worth fortunes. Men who thought they'd made smart deals now realized they'd been swindled. But Jack's attention was focused on a more immediate problem. The sheriff's office was dark, and there was no sign of Sheriff Hawkins, Blackwood's hand-picked lawman. "Where's the sheriff?" Jack asked. "Rode out this morning with a posse," Carlos replied. "Said he was going after the Apache who escaped." Jack and Tommy exchanged glances. Hawkins was either incompetent or complicit in Blackwood's schemes. Either way, they couldn't count on local law enforcement to handle the situation properly. "We need to get word to the territorial marshal," Jack decided. "Tommy, can you handle that?" "I'll send a telegraph first thing in the morning. The nearest marshal is probably in Tucson, but he'll come if he knows what's at stake." They secured Blackwood and his men in the jail cells, with Stone Bear posting 2 warriors as additional guards. The Apache leader didn't trust the local lawmen any more than Jack did. As they settled in to wait for dawn, Mrs. Patterson brought them coffee and food. She was a kind woman in her 50s who had always treated everyone fairly, regardless of race. "I feel like such a fool," she told Jack as she served him coffee. "Blackwood convinced me to sell my late husband's mining claim for $100. Said it was worthless rock. How many people did he buy out? Near everyone who owned land within 5 miles of Silver Creek. The Hendersons were the only ones who refused to sell." Jack was beginning to understand the full scope of Blackwood's operation. It wasn't just about one silver deposit. The man had been systematically acquiring mineral rights across a large area, using fraud, intimidation, and murder as necessary. "Mrs. Patterson, do you still have your deed paperwork?" "Of course, why?" "Because when the territorial investigators get here, you're going to need proof of what Blackwood paid you versus what the land was really worth." The widow's eyes widened as she understood. "You think we might get our land back?" "I think you might get a lot more than that. If Blackwood used fraud to acquire those deeds, they're not legal. The territorial government will have to sort out the real ownership." Morning Star, who had been listening to the conversation, spoke up. "My people also have claims to this land. Treaties signed with Washington. This complicated matters considerably. The Apache had legitimate treaty rights to much of the area. Rights that Blackwood had completely ignored in his land-grabbing scheme." "One problem at a time," Jack said diplomatically. "First, we make sure Blackwood faces justice for murder. Then we can sort out who owns what." As the night wore on, Jack found himself in conversation with Stone Bear about the broader implications of what they'd discovered. "Your government will send soldiers to protect the silver," the Apache leader predicted. "They will say the treaties no longer matter." "Maybe, but maybe not. There are people in Washington who believe in honoring agreements. You believe this?" Jack considered the question carefully. "I believe there are good people everywhere, including in government. The trick is making sure they're the ones making the decisions." Before dawn, Tommy returned from the telegraph office with disturbing news. "The lines are down between here and Tucson. Cut clean through probably sometime yesterday." "Blackwood's work?" "Has to be. He's been planning this for a while." Jack realized they were facing a more sophisticated opponent than he'd initially thought. Blackwood hadn't just been operating locally. He'd been thinking several moves ahead, trying to control information flow. How long to get a message through by rider? 2 days to Tucson, maybe 3, depending on the weather. Then another day for the marshal to get back here. Too long. Blackwood's friends will have time to cover their tracks. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the morning air. Jack looked out the window to see Sheriff Hawkins riding into town with a dozen men, all heavily armed. "Tommy, get back to the telegraph office," Jack said urgently. "Try to get a message through to anyone who'll listen. The territorial governor, the army, anyone." "What about you?" "I'm going to have a conversation with your sheriff." Jack stepped out onto the street as Hawkins dismounted. The sheriff was a big man with a beer gut and cruel eyes. Exactly the kind of corrupt lawman who would work for someone like Blackwood. "Morrison, you're under arrest for interference with justice and inciting an Apache uprising," Hawkins announced loudly. "On whose authority?" "My authority? This is my town." "Your authority comes from the territorial government, Sheriff, and I don't think they're going to be too happy when they find out you've been helping a murderer." Hawkins's face reddened. "Blackwood's a respected businessman. You're a drifter with a reputation for violence. Then let's let the territorial marshal decide who's telling the truth." "There won't be any territorial marshal. The telegraph lines are down and it'll be weeks before anyone from Tucson thinks to check on Little Red Mesa." Jack smiled grimly. "You're forgetting something, Sheriff." "What's that?" "I've got Apache witnesses, and Apache riders can cover ground a lot faster than your telegraph lines." It was a bluff, but it worked. Hawkins glanced nervously at Stone Bear and his warriors who were still stationed around the jail. "You can't trust savage testimony in a court of law," Hawkins blustered. "Maybe not, but I can trust the testimony of Deputy Walsh, Mrs. Patterson, Carlos, and about a dozen other townspeople who saw what really happened yesterday." For the first time, Hawkins seemed to realize that his position might not be as secure as he'd thought. Several of the townspeople had gathered to listen to the conversation. and their faces showed growing anger as they understood how deeply they'd been betrayed. "You've got 5 minutes to release Blackwood and his men," Hawkins said, trying to regain control of the situation. "Or what? Or we'll take them by force." Jack looked around at Hawkins's men. Most were hired guns, but a few looked like local ranchers who might not be fully committed to violence against their own neighbors. "Before you start shooting, Sheriff, maybe you should ask yourself a question. What happens when the truth comes out? Because it will come out. Too many people know what really happened. The truth is what I say it is." But as Hawkins spoke, a new voice cut through the morning air. "Actually, Sheriff, the truth is what the evidence says it is." Everyone turned to see a tall man in a black suit riding into town. He wore a silver badge that caught the morning sunlight, and his bearing marked him as a man accustomed to authority. "Who the hell are you?" Hawkins demanded. "United States Marshal James Bradley. I've been investigating reports of irregularities in territorial land sales." Imagine my surprise when I arrived to find the main suspect in custody. Jack felt a surge of relief but also suspicion. The timing was too convenient. "How did you know to come here, Marshal?" Bradley smiled slightly. "Let's just say that certain parties in Washington have been keeping an eye on Mr. Blackwood's activities. When the telegraph lines went down yesterday, it confirmed some of our suspicions." Hawkins was backing toward his horse, clearly realizing that the situation had just turned completely against him. "I wouldn't try to run, Sheriff," Bradley advised calmly. "I've got federal warrants for you and Blackwood both." Marshal Bradley's arrival changed everything. Within an hour, he had taken control of the jail, examined the evidence, and begun interviewing witnesses. His efficiency suggested this wasn't his first encounter with frontier corruption. "Tell me about yesterday's events," Bradley said to Jack as they sat in the sheriff's office. "Start from the beginning." Jack recounted the story while Bradley took careful notes. The marshal asked detailed questions about the evidence they'd found at Silver Creek and the condition of the Henderson homestead. "You say there were shod horse tracks at both locations?" "At least 8 riders, probably more. Tommy can confirm that. He was with the original posse that found the bodies." Bradley nodded thoughtfully. "What about Blackwood's claims of powerful political connections?" "Could be bluffing, but I wouldn't count on it. Men like him usually have friends in high places." "They do indeed, which is why I've been building this case very carefully for the past 6 months." Jack looked up in surprise. 6 months? Blackwood's operation extends far beyond Red Mesa. We've identified similar schemes in at least 4 other territories. Land fraud, intimidation, murder, all to acquire mineral rights for Eastern investors. "Who's backing him?" Bradley's expression darkened. "Some very wealthy people who prefer to remain anonymous. Railroad barons, mining magnates, politicians who benefit from territorial development contracts." The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. What had seemed like a local problem was actually part of a much larger pattern of corruption, reaching into the highest levels of territorial government. "Where do the Apache fit into this?" Jack asked. "Convenient scapegoats. Apache raids make good cover for murders, and they justify bringing in more federal troops to protect the settlers. More troops mean more government contracts for supplies, transportation, everything the conspirators need to profit from territorial development." So the Henderson murders were just the beginning? Probably. Blackwood was likely planning to escalate the violence, maybe stage a few more Apache attacks to justify a military response. Through the window, Jack could see Stone Bear and his warriors maintaining their vigil around the jail. The Apache leader had been remarkably patient, but Jack sensed that patience was wearing thin. What happens to the Apache in all this? That depends. If we can prove their innocence conclusively and expose the real conspiracy, it might actually help their legal position. The territorial government will be eager to make amends to avoid a wider scandal. And if we can't prove it, Bradley's silence was answer enough. Tommy entered the office, his arm in a proper sling provided by the town doctor. "Marshal, I've been going through the sheriff's files like you asked. Found something interesting." He handed Bradley a folder containing official-looking documents, purchase agreements for mineral rights signed by Hawkins as a witness. Dates go back almost 2 years. Bradley examined the papers carefully. "These signatures look forged to me. Mrs. Patterson says she never signed anything like this." "That's not the interesting part," Tommy continued. "Look at the bank drafts used to pay for the land." The marshal studied the financial documents and his eyebrows rose. These are drawn on a bank in Denver that went out of business 6 months ago. Meaning Blackwood was paying people with worthless paper. Even the money was fake. Jack shook his head in amazement. How many people did he swindle? Near everyone in the county who owned land with mineral potential, Tommy replied. And now that word's getting out about the silver, people are getting angry. Indeed, a crowd was gathering in the street outside. Jack could hear voices raised in anger as more townspeople discovered how thoroughly they'd been cheated. We need to address this before it gets out of hand, Bradley decided. A lynch mob won't help anyone. They stepped out onto the office porch where Bradley raised his voice to address the growing crowd. People of Red Mesa, I understand your anger. You've been the victims of a sophisticated fraud operation, but I promise you that justice will be served through proper legal channels. What about our land? Called out Carlos. Some of us sold everything we had for promises that turned out to be lies. The territorial government will review every transaction. Where fraud can be proven, those sales will be declared invalid. You'll get your land back. And compensation for what we lost. That will depend on how much we can recover from Blackwood's assets and his associates. Mrs. Patterson pushed forward through the crowd. What about the silver? Who gets to claim that? This was the question Jack had been dreading. The silver deposit would be worth millions, but multiple parties had legitimate claims to it. The Territorial Mining Commission will conduct proper surveys and establish legal claims according to federal law, Bradley announced. Anyone with valid ownership will receive fair compensation. What about the Apache? Stone Bear had approached quietly, speaking in clear English. Our people have treaty rights to this land. A murmur ran through the crowd. The relationship between the townspeople and the local Apache had always been tense, but recent events had complicated things considerably. The treaty rights will be honored, Bradley promised. The federal government stands behind its agreements with the Apache Nation. Pretty words, Stone Bear replied skeptically. But your government has broken many promises before. This time will be different. Too many people are watching, Jack stepped forward. Stone Bear, your warriors helped save innocent lives yesterday. These people know that. They won't forget it. Several townspeople nodded in agreement. Carlos spoke up first. The Apache did nothing wrong. They were blamed for crimes they didn't commit. And they fought alongside us against the real killers, added Mrs. Patterson. It wasn't exactly a love fest, but it was a start. The shared experience of being victimized by Blackwood's schemes had created an unexpected bond between the townspeople and the Apache. There's going to be enough silver for everyone, Bradley announced. Legal mining operations will create jobs for anyone willing to work. Apache, Mexican, American, it doesn't matter. What matters is building something honest. But even as he spoke, Jack noticed movement on the horizon. A dust cloud was approaching from the east, kicked up by what looked like a large group of riders. Marshal, Jack said quietly, pointing toward the approaching dust cloud. Bradley squinted against the morning sun. Cavalry patrol by the look of it. About a company's worth. You expecting military support? No, and that worries me. Tommy had spotted the riders too. Could be reinforcements for Blackwood. He claimed to have friends in high places. The crowd was getting restless as they noticed the approaching horsemen. Many remembered the Indian Wars and the heavy-handed tactics sometimes used by the military. Stone Bear, Jack called out. You might want to have your warriors ready for anything. The Apache leader nodded grimly. He'd been through enough broken promises and betrayals to expect the worst from any official government response. As the cavalry unit drew closer, Jack could make out details. It was indeed a full company. About 80 soldiers led by a captain riding under federal colors. But something about their formation and speed suggested this wasn't a routine patrol. They're riding hard, Bradley observed, like they're trying to get here before something happens. Or to make something happen, Jack replied darkly. The lead rider broke away from the column and galloped ahead. As he approached, Jack could see captain's bars on his shoulders and a face he recognized from old military newspapers. Captain Marcus Stone, Bradley said, apparently recognizing the officer as well. He's got a reputation for following orders no matter what those orders are. Stone reined in his horse in front of the jail. He was a young officer, probably in his early 30s, with the kind of rigid posture that spoke of military academy training and complete faith in the chain of command. Marshal Bradley, I'm here under orders from the territorial commander to restore order and protect federal interests. What federal interest would those be, Captain? Mineral resources critical to national security. I have authorization to establish martial law if necessary. Jack felt his blood run cold. Someone with real power was making a play to take control of the silver deposit, using the military to bypass normal legal processes. Who gave you those orders? General Morrison, Territorial Military Commander. Acting under authority from the War Department, the name hit Jack like a physical blow. General Morrison was his own father, the man he'd disowned years earlier over their disagreements about military policy toward Native Americans. This gets more interesting by the minute, Bradley muttered. The revelation about General Morrison sent a wave of shock through Jack. His father had always been ambitious and politically connected, but using military force to secure mining rights seemed extreme even for him. Captain Stone, Jack stepped forward. I'm Jack Morrison. General Morrison's son? The young officer's eyes widened in surprise. Sir, I wasn't aware you were involved in this situation. I'm involved because innocent people were about to be hanged for crimes they didn't commit. What exactly are your orders? Captain Stone looked uncomfortable, clearly caught between military protocol and an unexpected family complication. To secure the mineral resources and establish federal control over the area until proper mining claims can be established. And the Apache? What are your orders regarding them? Any hostile Indians are to be detained and relocated to the reservation. Stone Bear and his warriors tensed at these words. They'd heard similar promises before, usually just before being marched away from their ancestral lands at gunpoint. These Apache aren't hostile, Jack said firmly. They helped expose the real criminals and saved innocent lives. With respect, sir, I have my orders. Marshal Bradley stepped forward. Captain, I'm conducting a federal investigation into territorial land fraud. Any military action that interferes with my investigation would be inappropriate. The territorial commander's authority supersedes local law enforcement, Marshal. Actually, it doesn't. Federal marshals report directly to the Attorney General, not the War Department. My investigation takes precedence. Jack could see the captain was getting flustered. Stone was clearly a competent officer, but he was out of his depth dealing with the political complexities of the situation. Captain, Jack said, before you take any action, maybe you should telegraph your commanding officer for clarification. Explain that you've encountered a federal investigation in progress. My orders were quite clear. Were they? Did General Morrison explain that you'd be interfering with a murder investigation? That you'd be protecting men who killed an innocent family to steal their land? Stone's confidence wavered. I was told this was about Indian raiders and illegal mining activities. Tommy stepped forward with the evidence folder. Captain, take a look at this. Forged documents, fraudulent bank drafts, murder to cover up land theft. This isn't about Apache raids. It's about corruption reaching all the way to your headquarters. The young officer examined the documents with growing concern. He was clearly beginning to understand that his orders might have been based on false information. Sir, if what you're saying is true, it's all true, Mrs. Patterson called out from the crowd. We were all victims of Blackwood's schemes. The Apache women they tried to hang were innocent. More townspeople voiced their agreement. Captain Stone found himself facing not hostile Indians and illegal miners, but a community united in support of the people he'd been ordered to arrest. Captain, Marshal Bradley said, I suggest you send that telegram to headquarters immediately. Explain the real situation here. I think you'll find that your orders will change very quickly. But before Stone could respond, another complication appeared. A lone rider was approaching fast from the direction of the telegraph office, and Jack recognized him as the telegraph operator. Marshal Bradley, the man called out as he reined in his horse. Got an urgent message for you from Washington. Bradley read the telegram quickly, his expression growing grim. This is from the Attorney General's office. There's been a development in the territorial corruption investigation. What kind of development? 3 territorial officials were arrested in Denver yesterday, including the mining commissioner and the territorial treasurer. Both were on Blackwood's payroll. Captain Stone looked increasingly uncomfortable. Sir, if territorial officials have been compromised, it means your orders might have come from people who were working for the wrong side. Jack finished. Captain, my father is a good soldier, but he's also ambitious. If someone convinced him this was about national security instead of private profit, I need to contact headquarters immediately, Stone decided. Use the jail's telegraph, Bradley suggested. but send it directly to the War Department in Washington, not through Territorial Command. As Captain Stone went to send his telegram, Jack turned his attention to the larger crowd that had gathered. Word was spreading throughout the county, and people were arriving from outlying ranches and homesteads to hear the latest developments. "What happens now?" Carlos asked. "Now we wait for Washington to sort out the chain of command," Bradley replied. "But I can tell you this, the corruption investigation is expanding. Every territorial official connected to Blackwood is going to be scrutinized." Stonebear approached Jack with concern in his eyes. "Your father is the military commander. Will he order attacks on my people? Not if he understands what really happened here. My father and I have our differences, but he's an honorable soldier. When he learns the truth, he'll do the right thing." Jack hoped that was true, but he wasn't entirely certain. Years of estrangement had left him unsure about his father's current priorities. Captain Stone returned from the telegraph office looking relieved. "I've received new orders directly from the Secretary of War. I'm to cooperate fully with Marshal Bradley's investigation and take no action against any Apache unless they commit actual hostile acts. What about the mineral rights? All claims are frozen pending the federal investigation. No mining activity is authorized until the legal ownership is determined." This drew mixed reactions from the crowd. Some people were disappointed about the delay in potential profits, but others were relieved that the situation would be handled fairly. "How long will that take?" Mrs. Patterson asked. "Could be months," Bradley admitted. "But it's better to do it right than to repeat the mistakes that got us into this mess." Morningstar spoke up for the first time since the cavalry had arrived. "My people do not seek to deny others their rightful share. We seek only justice and respect for the agreements made with your government." "And you'll have both," Bradley promised. "The federal investigation will ensure that all legitimate claims are honored." As the immediate crisis seemed to be resolving, Jack found himself reflecting on the events of the past day. What had started as a simple attempt to prevent an injustice had revealed a conspiracy reaching from local officials to territorial government and possibly beyond. "Morrison," Marshal Bradley called out, "I could use a man with your skills on this investigation. The corruption network extends far beyond Red Mesa, and I need people I can trust. I'm not much of a lawman. You're honest, competent, and you've already proven you'll stand up for what's right. That's more qualification than most badges carry these days." Jack looked around at the faces surrounding him, Apache and white, Mexican and American, all united by their shared experience of being victimized by corruption and their determination to build something better. "What about them?" he asked, gesturing toward the crowd. "They'll be fine. Captain Stone will maintain order while the legal issues get sorted out. The real work happens in courtrooms and government offices now." Before Jack could answer, another rider approached. This one wore the uniform of a territorial telegraph messenger and carried an official-looking envelope. "Message for Jack Morrison," the messenger announced. Jack opened the envelope with some trepidation. The message was brief but significant. "Son, received reports of your involvement in Red Mesa situation. Proud of your actions. Investigating corruption in my command will ensure justice for all parties. Your father." The simple message carried more emotional weight than Jack had expected. After years of estrangement, his father's approval meant something he hadn't realized he'd been missing. "Good news?" Bradley asked. "Family business," Jack replied, but he was smiling for the first time in days. Stonebear extended his hand to Jack in the white man's gesture of farewell. "You have proven yourself a friend to the Apache. Our people will remember. Just make sure the real story gets told. That's how we prevent this from happening again." As the day wore on, the immediate crisis continued to resolve itself. Blackwood and his associates were securely in federal custody. Captain Stone's soldiers had established a peaceful camp outside town, more to protect the area from potential claim jumpers than to threaten anyone. The Apache warriors had returned to their families, satisfied that justice was being served. But Jack knew that the real work was just beginning. The corruption network that Blackwood represented had roots throughout the territorial government and beyond. Untangling it would take time, patience, and the kind of detailed investigation that Jack had never been interested in before. Standing in front of the Red Mesa jail as the sun set, Jack realized that his days as a rootless drifter were probably over. He'd found a cause worth fighting for and people worth protecting. More importantly, he'd discovered that justice wasn't just about quick draws and frontier vengeance. It was about building systems that protected everyone, regardless of their race or social position. The silver deposit would eventually be mined, bringing wealth and development to the region. But more importantly, it would be done legally and fairly, with all parties receiving their rightful share. The Apache would retain their treaty rights while participating in the new economy. The townspeople would recover from their losses and build a more prosperous community. And Jack Morrison, formerly known as Lone Wolf, would help make sure that corruption like Blackwood's never again threatened the people of the territories. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was the life he'd chosen, and for the first time in years that felt like enough.